The moment they told me I needed permission to enter my own family's farm, I knew someone had confused confidence with ownership. The heavy steel gate slammed shut with a metallic echo that rolled across the open fields like distant thunder. A line of SUVs stretched down the narrow county road, their engines idling beneath the bright Texas sun, while impatient drivers leaned on their horns one after another. Dust floated through the warm morning air, mixing with the familiar scent of dry hay and cedar that had welcomed my family home for 3 generations. Beyond the gate stood 4 HOA security guards in crisp uniforms, talking into radios as if they were protecting a military installation instead of blocking a gravel road my grandfather paid to build almost 50 years ago. The woman leading them, Patricia Collins, stood with her arms folded and sunglasses reflecting the growing traffic jam behind her. She looked furious. I quietly pressed a small black remote in my hand. Somewhere behind the thick cedar fence, powerful electric motors hummed for a second before the steel entrance locked itself with a deep mechanical click that everyone on that road could hear. The expressions around me changed instantly. Confusion turned into disbelief. Disbelief became panic. Delivery trucks stopped. Landscaping crews climbed out of their pickups. Parents trying to reach the subdivision for school drop-offs stared at the closed entrance, wondering why the only paved road leading into their luxury neighborhood had suddenly disappeared behind 8 tons of reinforced steel. Patricia marched toward me, the sharp smell of expensive perfume barely covering the scent of hot asphalt baking beneath the July heat. "You can't do this," she snapped, holding up her phone as though dialing someone important would somehow reopen the gate. I looked past her toward the road winding through the oak trees. Every inch of that road had been carved out by my grandfather with borrowed equipment, stubborn determination, and more weekends than anyone could count. I remembered riding beside him in an old pickup, listening to gravel crunch beneath the tires while he told me that land never forgets. Who respects it? At the time I thought he was talking about farming. Years later, I finally understood he was talking about people. The sheriff's cruiser arrived 10 minutes later, tires rolling slowly over the same pavement everyone believed belonged to the HOA. Patricia hurried over before the deputy even stepped out, pointing directly at me with complete confidence. I stayed exactly where I was, one hand resting on the weathered wooden fence, listening to cicadas buzz from the nearby pasture and feeling the same steady breeze that had crossed these fields long before any subdivision existed. The deputy looked at the gate, then at the county survey markers beside the fence line, and finally at the folder tucked beneath my arm. He sighed softly, tipped his hat back, and asked to see the paperwork. I handed it over without saying a word. Sometimes the strongest argument isn't spoken at all. It's signed, recorded, and waiting patiently in a county archive until someone arrogant gives it a reason to matter. 18 days earlier, none of those people had ever heard my name, and that was perfectly fine with me. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 36 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life designing roads, drainage systems, and bridges across Texas. My work taught me something that blueprints never hide. Every piece of land tells the truth if you know where to look. Concrete cracks. Survey pins move. Trees grow. But legal boundaries have a way of surviving long after people forget they exist. My family never measured our farm by market value. We measured it by memories. 400 acres of rolling pasture, live oak trees older than the state highway, 2 ponds that reflected every sunrise I could remember, and a gravel road that connected every chapter of our lives. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought the first 80 acres in the early 1970s after returning from years of working cattle across West Texas. He slowly added neighboring parcels whenever another rancher decided to retire until the property became the place where every Thanksgiving, every branding season, every family reunion, and every quiet Sunday afternoon seemed to happen naturally. Even after my parents passed the farm to me, I never thought of myself as the owner. I simply saw myself as the next caretaker. The old farmhouse still smelled like cedar lumber, fresh coffee, and worn leather every time I unlocked the front door. Granddad kept every tool exactly where he believed it belonged. His workbench carried decades of tiny scratches from repairing tractors, sharpening fence pliers, and fixing whatever broke before sunrise. Above that bench hung one framed photograph of him standing beside the very road everyone was arguing about now. He smiled in that picture, holding a shovel with dusty boots planted firmly in the gravel. I remember asking him once why he insisted on building the entrance wider than necessary. He laughed, tipped his old hat back, and said that someday people would need that road more than they realized. At the time, I assumed he meant cattle trailers or combines. Looking back, I think he already understood something about growth that I was too young to appreciate. Things began changing 2 years earlier when a developer purchased the neighboring ranch and announced plans for an upscale subdivision with walking trails, decorative ponds, and hundreds of new homes. At first, I welcomed the new neighbors. Growth had always been part of Texas. Families needed places to live, and I had no interest in fighting progress. Construction crews waved whenever they passed my entrance. Surveyors occasionally stopped to ask about old fence lines, and I gladly pointed them in the right direction. Everything felt respectful until the subdivision officially opened and the Homeowners Association elected Patricia Collins as president. The atmosphere shifted almost overnight. New signs appeared along the county road. Security patrol vehicles became a daily sight. Temporary orange cones slowly turned into permanent barriers. Every month, the subdivision seemed to push a little farther toward my fence line. I noticed it, but I never imagined anyone would eventually believe they could control the road my grandfather built with his own hands. That assumption would become the most expensive mistake Patricia Collins ever made. Patricia Collins had the remarkable talent of making ordinary neighborhood rules sound like federal law. She was 52 years old, always dressed like she was heading to a real estate magazine photo shoot, and drove a pearl-white luxury sport utility vehicle that somehow never seemed to collect dust, even on rural Texas roads. Her smile was polished enough to sell million-dollar homes, but it disappeared the moment someone questioned her authority. Around the subdivision, people spoke about her in lowered voices while checking over their shoulders. She had turned monthly Homeowners Association meetings into performances where every landscaping complaint sounded like a national emergency. Mailboxes became debates. Fence colors became investigations. Trash cans left outside an extra hour somehow threatened property values. Most residents simply paid the fines because it was easier than arguing. I was different only because I was not actually part of the subdivision. That detail seemed to bother Patricia more than anything else. My land surrounded nearly half of the community's western boundary, and the gravel entrance my grandfather built connected directly to the county highway. As new phases of construction expanded, builders quietly began routing more trucks past my entrance because it was shorter than using the temporary construction roads. I did not object. The crews waved every morning, kept the speed down, and never left trash behind. Then the permanent residents arrived. Within weeks, I noticed unfamiliar cars driving farther onto my property before turning around. Joggers wandered down the gravel lane as if it were a public trail. Delivery drivers stopped at my barn asking for subdivision addresses that did not exist anywhere near my fields. Someone had even added my entrance to an online neighborhood map labeled as the Western Community Access Road. The first time I met Patricia in person, she stepped out of her vehicle carrying a clipboard thick enough to qualify as furniture. The smell of fresh cut grass drifted across the roadside, while sprinklers clicked rhythmically behind her. She greeted me with the practiced confidence of someone expecting immediate agreement. She explained that the neighborhood had grown faster than expected and that my entrance was becoming an important traffic corridor for residents. Then she smiled and said they intended to improve the road for everyone's benefit. Improve. That single word caught my attention. I looked down at the gravel beneath my boots, listening to the familiar crunch as I shifted my weight. That road drained perfectly after heavy rain because my grandfather had crowned it by hand and installed proper culverts decades earlier. It had survived floods, droughts, overloaded cattle trailers, and construction equipment without needing anyone's approval. I thanked her for stopping by and politely explained that the road was private property. Her expression changed for only a second before the smile returned. She nodded, wished me a pleasant afternoon, and drove away. I watched the dust settle behind her tires, thinking the conversation had ended respectfully. I could not have been more mistaken. Less than 1 week later, bright orange survey flags appeared along the edge of my entrance. A temporary security sign stood beside my fence. By the following Monday morning, 2 uniformed guards were parked beside a freshly installed barrier, waving subdivision traffic through while slowing every vehicle heading toward my farm. That was the first moment I realized Patricia had never come to ask for permission. She had come to measure how much resistance she should expect. The following morning started with the familiar smell of fresh coffee drifting across my kitchen, but it was drowned out by the deep growl of diesel engines outside. When I stepped onto the porch, 3 pickup trucks with Homeowners Association security logos were parked beside my entrance. Orange traffic barrels lined both sides of the gravel road, and a portable electronic sign flashed community access ahead in bright amber letters. For a moment, I honestly thought the county had scheduled emergency road work without notifying me. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. My old wooden private property sign had disappeared. In its place stood a brand new metal sign carrying the subdivision logo and neatly printed arrows directing residents toward what it called the west entrance. I walked down the driveway with gravel crunching beneath my boots, the morning air carrying the scent of damp earth from the pasture after a light overnight rain. One of the guards stepped forward before I reached the barrier. He smiled politely enough, but there was nothing friendly about the way he positioned himself directly in front of my truck. He asked for my identification and my resident access sticker. I actually laughed because I thought he had mistaken me for someone else. I pointed beyond the fence toward the farmhouse sitting nearly half a mile away and calmly explained that I lived there. The guard glanced at a clipboard, shook his head, and replied that the property beyond the checkpoint required authorization through the Homeowners Association Management Office until ownership records could be verified. Ownership records. I had paid county taxes on that farm for years, yet a complete stranger was asking me to prove I belonged there. Before I could answer, Patricia arrived in her white sport utility vehicle as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. She stepped out holding another folder filled with neatly organized papers and greeted me with the same polished smile I had seen a week earlier. She explained that traffic studies showed the entrance now served the surrounding community and that temporary access controls were necessary for neighborhood safety. She spoke with complete confidence, using phrases that sounded official enough to impress anyone who did not know the difference between private property and community regulations. Then she handed me a packet describing new traffic procedures, visitor registration requirements, delivery schedules, and proposed maintenance fees for the road my own grandfather had built. I slowly flipped through the pages while listening to birds singing from the oak trees behind us. Every paragraph referred to the entrance as shared infrastructure. Every map colored my road exactly the same way it colored subdivision streets. It looked convincing until I noticed one small detail. None of the pages carried a county seal, a survey reference, or a recorded document number. They were simply internal Homeowners Association paperwork presented with enough confidence to resemble law. I handed the packet back without raising my voice. Patricia's smile faded for the first time. She reminded me that cooperation usually produced better outcomes than conflict. I thanked her for the advice, climbed back into my truck, and turned around without another word. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of those temporary barriers standing on ground my family had cared for longer than most of the houses behind them had even existed. That quiet drive back to the farmhouse was the moment I stopped thinking about arguing. Engineers solve problems with measurements, records, and patience. I had a feeling every one of those would soon become far more valuable than anger. Over the next several days, I tried every reasonable path before I even considered fighting back. My first stop was the county engineering office where I had worked with survey crews more times than I could count. The receptionist recognized me immediately and pointed me toward a records technician who spent nearly an hour pulling subdivision plats, roadway permits, and public access filings. The quiet hum of scanners filled the room while old paper carried that unmistakable scent of dust and aging ink. Every document told the same story. The subdivision roads ended exactly where my property began. There was no recorded dedication, no public easement, and no county approval transferring control of my entrance to anyone else. On paper, nothing had changed. Outside, however, everything had. I drove back to the farm expecting common sense to prevail once the facts became clear. Instead, the checkpoint had grown larger. Fresh concrete barriers replaced the temporary barrels. New security cameras overlooked the entrance. A polished sign welcomed residents to the western neighborhood access point as though it had existed for decades. Delivery drivers carrying livestock feed stopped beside the guard station, confused after being told they needed authorization to enter private farmland. One truck carrying fencing supplies turned around entirely because the driver did not want to argue with uniformed guards. My veterinarian called that afternoon to apologize for missing a scheduled visit after security informed him the road beyond the checkpoint was restricted. Standing beside my barn, I could smell fresh alfalfa stacked inside, while hearing cattle call from the north pasture, waiting for supplies that never arrived. None of this was accidental anymore. It was organized. I contacted the county sheriff's office, hoping a simple conversation would clear things up. The deputy who responded listened carefully, walked the property line with me, and studied the temporary barriers. He admitted the ownership records appeared straightforward, but because no crime had occurred and both sides claimed legal authority over access management, he encouraged everyone to resolve the dispute through documentation instead of confrontation. It was a fair answer, even if it solved nothing that day. Patricia understood exactly how uncertainty worked. Every extra day made the checkpoint appear more permanent. Residents slowly accepted the barriers as normal. Visitors assumed the guards belonged there because nobody questions a person wearing a uniform with enough confidence. A few neighbors even waved at the checkpoint while driving through, never realizing they were crossing private property controlled by someone who had never granted permission. Then the certified letters started arriving. The first demanded that I register all future farm equipment entering the property through what Patricia described as the community transportation corridor. The second proposed monthly maintenance assessments for road improvements that had never been approved by me. The third politely informed me that unauthorized modifications to traffic patterns could result in penalties under subdivision regulations. I placed every letter into a growing file cabinet inside my grandfather's office without responding. Anger accomplishes very little when someone is building their case on assumptions. Evidence accomplishes everything. Late one evening, I sat alone at Granddad's scarred oak desk while the soft ticking of his old wall clock echoed through the quiet farmhouse. The fading sunlight stretched across shelves filled with decades of neatly labeled binders. He had always believed important papers deserved better care than expensive furniture. As I looked around that familiar room, something caught my eye on the very top shelf. It was a long rectangular storage tube covered with years of dust, sitting exactly where he had left it. Somehow, I had the feeling the answers Patricia never expected me to find had been waiting there all along. The cardboard tube released a faint smell of old paper and cedar the moment I twisted the cap loose. A cloud of dust drifted through the late afternoon sunlight pouring across my grandfather's office, and for a second it felt like the room had been waiting for someone to open it again. Inside were rolled survey maps, yellowed engineering drawings, and several carefully folded documents tied together with faded cotton string. Granddad had always believed that if something mattered, you protected it twice. Once with hard work and once with paperwork. I gently spread the largest survey across the desk, holding the corners down with heavy steel wrenches that had belonged to him for decades. The map was dated 1978 and carried the raised seal of the county surveyor along with the signature of the engineering firm that designed the entrance road. Every measurement matched the gravel lane outside within inches. The center line, drainage ditches, culverts, and fence setbacks were all there exactly as they existed today. More importantly, the property boundary placed the entire entrance road inside our deeded land. Not half of it, every single foot. Beneath the survey rested another document that immediately caught my attention. It was a recorded easement agreement signed by neighboring ranch owners nearly 50 years earlier. The language was simple enough for anyone to understand. My family granted temporary agricultural access across the road to adjoining landowners, but ownership, maintenance, improvements, and the unrestricted right to suspend access always remained with the Walker family. I read that paragraph 3 times to make sure I had not misunderstood it. The right to suspend access. Those 5 words changed everything. My pulse stayed steady, but I could feel the weight of the entire dispute shifting. Patricia had spent weeks acting as though controlling traffic somehow created ownership. This document proved the exact opposite. The next folder contained county maintenance correspondence, drainage permits, and inspection reports spanning more than 4 decades. Every culvert replacement, every grading project, every repair after heavy storms had been completed by my family or contractors hired directly by us. There was not a single record showing the subdivision, the Homeowners Association, or any developer contributing $1 toward the road they now claimed as community infrastructure. Then I found the final piece. Folded between two engineering sketches was a handwritten letter from my grandfather addressed to whoever might someday inherit the farm. His handwriting leaned slightly to the right, just like I remembered from every birthday card he ever gave me. He wrote that land disputes rarely begin with fences. They begin when people stop respecting records. He reminded me never to argue when documents could speak more clearly than emotions. At the bottom, he listed the names of the county clerk, the survey office, and the engineering archive where certified copies had been filed decades earlier. I could almost hear his calm voice saying that patience wins arguments long before a courtroom ever does. Outside the office window, the evening breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut pasture grass, while the old windmill creaked slowly above the barn. I rolled the survey back into its tube, organized every document into a new binder, and made certified copy requests first thing the next morning. I was no longer searching for proof. I already had it. Now I simply needed the official copies that would allow every signature, every seal, and every recorded page to tell the story exactly the way my grandfather intended. By the time the certified copies arrived from the county clerk, I had already made one decision that surprised even me. I was not going to confront Patricia. I was not going to send threatening letters or argue at another Homeowners Association meeting. Every evening after work, I quietly drove the length of the entrance road with a camera mounted inside my truck, recording every vehicle entering and leaving through property that legally belonged to my family. The tires rolled over the same gravel my grandfather had packed decades earlier, producing that familiar crunch that somehow sounded different now, almost like the road itself was reminding me who had built it. I documented landscaping crews, delivery vans, school buses, moving trucks, and security patrol vehicles using the entrance exactly as Patricia insisted they should. Every recording included timestamps, survey markers, and clear views of the property boundaries. Meanwhile, I hired an independent licensed surveyor to verify every corner monument shown on the original 1978 plat. Watching him work was almost relaxing. He moved carefully from marker to marker with professional precision, while the soft electronic chirp of his survey equipment echoed across the pasture. Each buried iron pin appeared exactly where the original drawings said it would be. Decades of storms, droughts, and development had changed the landscape, but they had not moved the legal line by even an inch. The final survey matched my grandfather's documents almost perfectly. I forwarded the certified survey, the recorded easement, and the maintenance records to a property attorney who specialized in rural land rights. He read everything without interruption, then leaned back in his chair and smiled. He said something I will never forget. He told me that sometimes the strongest legal position belongs to the person who speaks the least. Instead of filing an immediate lawsuit, he recommended following every required procedure exactly as written in the recorded documents. We prepared formal notices stating that unauthorized commercial use of the private access road would end after the legally required notice period expired. Certified copies were mailed to the Homeowners Association Management Company, the subdivision developer, the county planning office, emergency services, utility providers, and every organization directly affected. Nobody could later claim they had not been informed. During those 2 weeks, Patricia became even more confident. The temporary checkpoint turned into a permanent-looking security station with decorative flower planters and freshly painted curbs. Residents waved cheerfully at the guards while driving across property they believed belonged to their neighborhood. Someone even installed banners advertising the community's beautiful western entrance. Every new decoration became another photograph in my growing evidence file. I simply kept documenting everything while saying almost nothing. The final piece fell into place 3 days before the notice period expired. A local contractor delivered the custom steel gate I had ordered weeks earlier. Dark powder-coated steel, heavy-duty hinges, commercial-grade electronic operators, and a discreet keypad mounted inside my fence line. The installation crew worked quietly from sunrise until sunset, their welding equipment sending brief flashes across the evening fields, while the smell of fresh-cut steel mixed with warm cedar carried through the breeze. When they finished, the entrance looked almost exactly as it always had, Except now one carefully engineered gate stood precisely on the surveyed property line. It was not built to trap anyone. It was built to exercise a right that had been recorded nearly 50 years before Patricia Collins ever imagined she could manage someone else's road. Monday morning arrived with the cool smell of damp grass still hanging over the pasture before the Texas heat settled in. A thin layer of fog floated above the low fields, and the only sounds were birds calling from the oak trees and the steady hum of the new gate waiting quietly at the property line. I parked my truck beside the fence just before 6 o'clock, coffee warming my hands while the eastern sky slowly turned gold. The notice period had officially expired at midnight. Everything that happened next followed documents recorded decades before anyone built a single house behind me. At exactly 6:15, I pressed the same black remote resting in my pocket. The electric motors came alive with a smooth mechanical hum, and the steel gate rolled across the entrance until it settled gently into place with a deep metallic click. No drama, no shouting, just a gate closing on private property exactly as the recorded easement allowed. Within minutes, the morning routine of the subdivision began unraveling. Landscaping trailers arrived first, followed by delivery vans, contractors, commuters, and parents driving children toward school. One by one they slowed, stopped, and stared at the newly installed entrance. Engines idled. Turn signals blinked. Confused drivers stepped out to read the freshly mounted sign explaining that private access had been suspended according to recorded property rights and directing all traffic toward the public county entrance several miles away. Most people simply turned around without complaint. They were not the problem. They had trusted what they had been told. The security guards looked far more surprised. They spoke urgently into their radios while glancing back and forth between the locked gate and the subdivision behind them. About 20 minutes later, Patricia's white sport utility vehicle appeared at the front of a growing line of traffic. She climbed out quickly, her expression confident at first, then increasingly uncertain as she noticed the licensed survey markers, the recorded document reference numbers printed on the notice board, and the attorney's contact information posted beneath them. She demanded that the guards open the entrance, but they quietly reminded her they had never possessed a key. There had never been one because the gate belonged to my family. A county deputy arrived shortly afterward, followed by a representative from the planning office who had already received every certified notice weeks earlier. The deputy greeted me politely, reviewed the recorded documents, compared them with the survey markers, and walked the property line without rushing. Warm sunlight reflected off the steel gate, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar through the entrance exactly as it had every morning since I was a child. After several minutes, the deputy returned to Patricia and calmly explained that the entrance stood entirely on private property and that the owner had exercised a documented right after providing proper notice through the appropriate legal process. Nobody was being removed. Nobody was being threatened. The access route had simply returned to the legal status it had always held. Patricia stood silently for the first time since I had known her. Behind her, the long line of vehicles slowly turned around and headed toward the official public entrance that had been available all along. I watched the gravel settle beneath the morning breeze and thought about my grandfather's words. Land remembers who respects it. And on that quiet Monday morning, every survey marker, every recorded page, every patient decision, and every mile of that old road finally spoke louder than anyone ever could. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. The security checkpoint disappeared first. One morning I drove toward the entrance with the windows down, breathing in the clean scent of fresh pasture after an overnight rain, and the temporary guard station was simply gone. The decorative flower planters had been removed. The banners welcoming visitors to the western entrance had vanished. Even the polished signs pointing traffic across my property had disappeared without a trace. It was as though the entire operation had never existed. A week later, my attorney called while I was repairing an old section of fence near the north pasture. The metallic ring of my fencing pliers echoed through the morning air as I answered. The Homeowners Association wanted to negotiate. Not argue. Not threaten. Negotiate. Their attorney acknowledged the recorded surveys, the easement language, and the maintenance history that stretched back nearly 5 decades. They requested a meeting at the county offices with everyone present, including planning officials and survey representatives. The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and stacks of paper, the same familiar combination found in government buildings all across Texas. Patricia looked different from the woman who had first arrived carrying a clipboard full of assumptions. The confidence had been replaced by careful attention to every document placed on the table. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused anyone of anything. The county surveyor carefully explained the property lines. The planning representative confirmed that the subdivision had always possessed a fully approved public entrance that simply required minor traffic adjustments after the western access closed. My attorney reviewed the recorded easement one final time, and the room grew remarkably quiet. In the end, the agreement was surprisingly simple. The Homeowners Association formally acknowledged that the entrance road remained private property owned by the Walker family. Every internal map, resident guide, online directory, and neighborhood document identifying it as community infrastructure would be corrected. The unauthorized signs and security controls would never return. Future access across my road would require written permission, exactly as the recorded documents had always stated. A few days after everything was finalized, I stood beside the steel gate just before sunset. The golden light stretched across the gravel road, making every stone glow the way I remembered from childhood. I rested one hand on the weathered wooden fence while a gentle breeze carried the smell of cedar, hay, and freshly cut grass across the fields. The same windmill turned slowly above the barn. The same cattle grazed peacefully beyond the pond. Nothing about the land had changed. Only the people had finally learned to see it for what it had always been. I unfolded my grandfather's handwritten letter one last time before placing it back inside the office where it belonged. His words felt even more meaningful now than the day I found them. Land disputes do not begin with fences. They begin when people stop respecting records. He was right. I never won because I built a stronger gate. I won because someone before me believed that careful work deserved careful documentation. Every survey marker, every faded signature, every maintenance receipt, every quiet decision to stay patient became another stone in the foundation of that outcome. As the sun slipped below the horizon, I pressed the remote and the gate opened, smoothly toward the farm, welcoming only those who had a right to be there. Justice never arrived with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. It arrived one recorded document at a time, proving that the strongest property line is not drawn by emotion, but by truth patiently preserved across generations.